You are listening to the Choose Your Struggle podcast, a member of the Shameless Podcast Network. If you listen to the podcast, and of course you do because you're hearing this right now, you know that I always ask my guests what their preferred method of self-care is. Well, here's my answer: a good cup of coffee. This year has truly made me appreciate the little things that make my life better, and a good cup of coffee goes a long way. That's why I switched to Four Sigmatic, and I haven't gone back. They use mushrooms in their beans, and it gives me a kick in the morning that I didn't know I needed before, and now I miss if I have anything other than Four Sigmatic. Once you give them a try, trust me, you're not going to want to go back. So go check out the link in my show notes or on my podcast website, and use the code CHOOSEYOURSTRUGGLE, all one word, at checkout to get 10% off. Check out Four Sigmatic today. Welcome to episode 5 of Choose Your Struggle Season 2. This episode is with Will Godfrey of Filter Mag. But before that, take it away, Kid Mental.
Things ain't always gonna go our way, but you can always win when you choose your struggle. And some battles will be yesterday, but today is for a new beginning. Choose your struggle, and don't worry about what they say. You can always win when you choose your struggle, and you can bounce back just as Jay. Come on and listen to Choose Your Struggle. Choose your struggles. Choose your struggle. Choose your struggle.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Choose Your Struggle podcast. This is episode 5, the third full-length episode of the season, but episode 5. I hope you're enjoying the Monday Motivation podcast. I really like making those, and even more importantly, I love the responses I get from those. As promised, I've sent out some stickers and some magnets. If you go to my Choose Your Struggle Instagram and you go to, I don't know what they're called, memories or the saved post or whatever, above the main ones, the little circles, under my name and stuff, and you click on the one that says Choose Your Struggle merch, you'll see the things people have shared with me that, tagged me and that I've shared, them getting a sticker, them getting a magnet, whatever the case is. You'll also see, people who got tank tops. And by the way, I still have some of those. So if you haven't grabbed a tank top, do so. As a reminder, you can get a discount on all merch on Patreon, so definitely check out the Patreon, Choose Your Struggle at Patreon. Now, this week's episode, I have been a fan of Filter Mag for a couple of years, and last year I finally went, I've been reading them for so long, they deserve my money, they deserve to be paid for all this incredible stuff. So I made a donation to the nonprofit that is their backbone. And because of that, I was super lucky to build a relationship or start a conversation, I think is a better way to say it, with Will Godfrey, their editor-in-chief and the guy that makes this all possible. And because of that, that led to this interview. Now, Will gets really into, in a very expertly put explanation about why it's so important that Filter exists. And, just quickly from my own perspective, I read a lot of this stuff. I get Google alerts every day. I have probably 50 of them set up, and everything from substance misuse to addiction to mental health to drug policy. I mean, all these kind of words that I get articles sent to me every day about. And so many of the traditional media outlets, even the more progressive ones like Vice, so many of them don't do an incredible job around the topic of drug use. They will sort of every article will have like a paragraph that they'll throw to the more progressive or the more honest takes on things like substance misuse or drug policy. Even articles like outlets for like Vice that do sort of lean into it heavier, quite frankly, don't go far enough. And then there's Filter. And if their line is drawn from these traditional media outlets, Filter lives beyond it. And you'll hear Will talk a little bit about that. By the way, this isn't just my thoughts on this. I just yesterday, I was talking to a young woman who actually has written for Filter. And she was telling me that even these other areas that she's written for, she's written great articles for other publications, But when it comes to the topic of drug policy, only Filter will give her a voice because the things she's saying are too whatever, fill in the blank, too honest, too criticizing of certain tropes that we see in more traditional outlets. And so she doesn't get picked up, and then she writes about other topics, and they always publish her work. So this was straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. Another thing I love is when I see people that I respect who pop up, have written an article or two for Filter. You know, people that have been on this podcast before. Natalie Papillon and Tessie Castillo from last season both have written for Filter. And it always makes me happy when they pop up, and I immediately share. I share a lot of Filter stuff. In fact, if you're following the Choose Your Struggle Twitter or my personal Twitter, a lot of Filter stuff has been shared on there, and Filter does a great job of retweeting. So if you ever, you know, if that's a thing you're interested in, is trying to get the message out more about these topics, you know, tweet up a Filter article and tag them, and I almost guarantee you that they will retweet it, and it starts really great conversation. So props to Filter in many regards. Now, one more interesting thing about this conversation. This was taking place as the events at the Capitol unfolded. This wasn't even hey man, like, did you see that shit an hour ago? This was literally, are you watching the news right now? And, you know, it started probably half an hour before we got on Zoom, and my wife and I were standing at my computer watching everything unfold through the live stream. And I said to her, you know, I wonder if Will want to postpone because, you know, he's a journalist and all of this is going on. And I asked him when he got on the Zoom, I said, do you want to postpone? And he said no. He said, this is too important. Let's keep this conversation going. And I was really worried, actually, when I went to edit that we may sound distracted. It's hard to even formulate thoughts as this sort of action is going down. And at the time, we didn't really know what was going to come next. And so we both had the news on kind of in the background. But I don't think we did. I think we pulled it off very well. But just keep in mind that that's happening as we're having this conversation. So I hope you go from here and check out Filter. It'll be in the show notes as always. And you can find them online at just searching Filter Mag, Filter as in Filter. And it's really, you know, I signed up for their newsletter because I love that everything that I get, you know, multiple times a week that they send out their newsletter. It's not just their own stuff. They'll send out things that have to do with these topics. And it really gives me, it's like the best Google alert I have. You know, it gives me a great roundup of a lot of these incredible topics. So go check out Filter, sign up for their mailing list, but most importantly, enjoy this conversation with Will Godfrey. Ever since Mountain Made CBD founder Mike Passion came on the podcast way back in the beginning of season 1, I've been lucky enough to call them a sponsor. And I say lucky because I love CBD. I preach about it to everybody. Mountain Made is the best in the game. They've got lower than the federally compliant level of THC, so it ships nationwide, but they've got enough THC that you get the entourage effect. It's the best of both worlds. I love their Boost. It's a 10 milligram chewable. It's orange sherbet and white tea leaf flavor. It's fantastic. I take a couple of them throughout the day, and it's got me feeling pretty good. If you want to start the morning on a high note, they've got Build. Build is a 50 milligram quick release tablet. You take it with your coffee, you get it going in the morning, and you feel great throughout the day. At the end of the day, they've got Recover, and Recover is a 25 milligram chewable. It's mango flavored. It's got magnolia. It'll leave you feeling pretty nice at the end of the day. My wife and I even picked up their dog chewables, which our dog loves. She's got anxiety. She's a rescue dog. And just one of Mountain Made's chewables leaves her feeling pretty good. But here's the thing. Don't just take my word for it. I turned my wife on to Mountain Made, and she loves it. So let's hear what she has to say.
Mountain Made is the only CBD I have ever loved. The only CBD I've been willing to purchase over and over and over again. And I don't see that stopping.
So go to mountainmadecbd.com, and when you check out, tell them Choose Your Struggle sent you. Thanks for sharing the podcast with your friends. If you're listening on Apple, please rate and review, or check out the review link in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, my name's Will Godfrey. I'm the editor-in-chief of Filter, an online magazine that advocates through journalism for rational and compassionate approaches to drug policy, drug use, and human rights. And I'm the executive director of the Influence Foundation, which is the non-profit organization that owns and operates Filter.
And I will say, this is my, sort of heads up to all the listeners. Not only am I a reader who loves Filter very much, but I am also a financial supporter because I believe that much in what Filter is doing.
And we're extremely grateful to you.
So if you want to go ahead at this point now and kind of talk about why this topic, what got you interested in this, and help us understand who Will Godfrey is.
Well, thank you. Filter was founded by a group of us in the organization in 2017, and we went live in September 2018 to advocate, as our mission says, through journalism for rational and compassionate approaches to drug use, drug policy, and human rights. We felt, in fact, we knew that there was a gap in media to do this. Media massively fails on a wide scale to cover drug issues and intersection issues in a proportionate, fair, rational, and compassionate way. I know this because I ran several previous online publications in this kind of space before we started Filter. When I came to the United States about 10 years ago, I worked at a publication called The Fix, which was addiction and recovery focused, but covering lots of related issues, and had a spell eventually there as editor-in-chief. I then had the opportunity to found two other harm reduction-oriented publications in succession, one called Substance and one called The Influence. And that's where the mission of Filter, or the mission that evolved into Filter, originally developed. However, both of those other publications I mentioned were owned by interests in the more traditional rehab space, the rehab industry in the United States. And that created or some tensions and some conflicts in an editorial team that wanted to cover drugs from a harm reduction perspective and in a purely mission-driven way. And so that's why I and some others started a non-profit version of those publications so that the mission could continue to evolve. And we've been doing that since September 2018 when we went live. Prior to that, I was in London and I actually worked in the education department of a prison called Pentonville Prison, where I had the opportunity to co-found and edit a print publication that was written by and for incarcerated people in London. So that introduced me to many of the issues that my subsequent online publications have addressed. Filter tries to approach drugs in obviously through a harm reduction lens, but also in an open-minded way. Too many people have preconceptions and prejudices about drugs. First and foremost, that all people's relationship with drugs are harmful, which of course we know just isn't the case. Almost all of us use drugs in one form or another, and most people's relationships with drugs, even the most stigmatized and criminalized drugs that you can think of, are in fact not problematic. That's not to say that drug-related issues don't exist. They certainly do, but they are greatly exacerbated by the criminalization and stigmatization of these drugs and the people who use them. And so we're trying to come at it in a fresh way to acknowledge the beneficial and non-problematic relationships that people have with drugs, just as much as we acknowledge drug-related issues and, of course, the crisis of drug-involved deaths. Now, while drugs is our core, we can't possibly cover drugs without covering lots of other issues. Drug issues do not occur in a vacuum. We have to acknowledge that drug issues and the criminalization of drugs impact different demographics disproportionately. Drug policy in this country and elsewhere in the world is fundamentally racist. For example, we can't cover drugs without covering racism, without covering incarceration, without covering mental health, without covering sex work, and all kinds of other areas that very obviously intersect with drug issues. And so at Filter, we will always step out of our core subject, if you like, to cover obvious intersections pertaining to human rights and social justice linked with drug issues. But we will also step back to retain, I hope, our specialization and our harm reduction ethos by centering primarily on drugs.
Well, a lot to unpack in there, a lot of amazing things. And I'll start with this. The thing that I love the most about Filter is the honesty. There's no coaching. There's no sort of nodding towards, okay, well, this may not be true, but it's conventional wisdom. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of, I don't even want to say mainstream, because mainstream media has unfortunately taken on such a connotation. But the well-known journalists, sort of, even if they're arguing for harm reduction, they will spend parts of the article sort of, nodding to outdated and harmful ideas about drug use. Filter doesn't do any of that. And in fact, a lot of the incredible writers that you have at Filter challenge a lot of those beliefs.
Yes, I hope that we do. That's one of the principal reasons for our existence. I think it's absolutely vital to underline and emphasize all the time that the harms related to drugs very often depend on the context of drug use. For any kind of stigmatized or criminalized substance you can think of, there are accepted and legal versions. For example, fentanyl itself, which has attracted, understandably, so many headlines for its involvement in tens of thousands of US deaths per year, is also used as, in medical settings and with very beneficial outcomes. And so prohibition creates the environment that enables these great harms. And I think it's always important to center that. Similarly, with something like methamphetamine, we have Adderall, which is the pharmaceutical equivalent, and which I remember one of my previous publications working on a memorable article written by Carl Hart, whereby he compared the two, noted that they're chemically almost identical, and that the harms associated with meth that aren't necessarily associated with the pharmaceutical version depend heavily on the context of use. And so, we know that people can have non-problematic, safe, indeed beneficial relationships with drugs in all kinds of contexts, but not the context that is inflicted by the criminalization of drugs.
That's a really important point. That the people like to blame a lot of the crime and the dangers and all these horrible things that are reported on drugs without stepping back and going, oh, it's the prohibition. Like it's the same thing that we saw here in the States with prohibition on alcohol. The argument can be made that the minute that prohibition was over and all of a sudden the crime went away and people were just shocked, and yet we're doing it still for decades, for generations around drugs.
Yes, and the analogy with alcohol prohibition is a good one, because what did we see? We didn't see a reduction in alcohol-related harms. We saw the elevation of sort of homebrewed liquors that were particularly associated with harms. We saw the criminalization of people, not the criminalization of people, equally across the board, but of course, certain stigmatized demographics and groups of society that were disproportionately criminalized. But again and again, we don't seem to learn that this approach to drugs is harmful, it's unjust, and it causes far more problems than it solves. And we see even sort of new iterations of this kind of mentality applied, for example, to the new generation of nicotine products, vaping products, with flavor bans all over the country. Ethan Nadelman, the founder, of course, of Drug Policy Alliance, called this, he thinks it's the great new drug war of the 21st century, because again, we're reacting to the presence of a drug, a form of drug use that people find threatening. People associate and exaggerate its uptake among youth and teens. The think of the children argument, as it's always known, and thereby cracking down on it in a completely counterproductive way that criminalizes sections of society and does nothing to repair harms but creates them.
So this is first off, you and I could talk for hours. My like number one interest is drug policy and how stupid we are for the most part around drug policy. But why, as someone who studies this, like this is your life, is studying this stuff, why is it so hard for people to see shades of gray when it comes to drugs? We are such a black and white thinking people anyways. But when it comes to drugs, it is light and day. Night and day. It is good or bad. It is, there's no shades of gray, and that people struggle with this so much.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a complex question and there are a bunch of answers. I think an important part of it is othering. And we can talk first about othering of drugs. People create these mental and societal hierarchies of drugs based on their familiarity with or ignorance over certain drugs. For example, it would seem, most of us consume caffeine, and it would seem ridiculous to most people to ban that, or it has been done in some societies in history. And similarly, alcohol is so widespread that it's become, universally accepted by most people, although it is still unduly blamed and thrown under the bus in some circumstances. But many of the illegal and highly stigmatized drugs that we're talking about, for example, heroin, is actually used by very, very few people in the context of the broader population. And so people find it easier to stigmatize and scaremonger over drugs that of which they have little personal experience and which they don't know a great deal about. And I think one of the reasons that cannabis legalization, for example, has been able to take off in this country is that it's actually a relatively common substance for people to use. We know that 50% plus of the US population have at least used cannabis at some point in their life. And they know that the sort of the scare stories that have been shared about it are generally untrue. And so it's been easier for people to accept the normalization of cannabis. It's harder for people to accept the normalization of substances where they've just been exposed to so much propaganda of it, but they don't have relating to it, but they don't have much firsthand experience. Another piece of this othering, of course, is to do with racism and the other forms of prejudice that exist throughout our society. And of course, if people are not familiar with drugs, but they associate the use of those drugs with different demographic groups of people, demographic groups that are marginalized and which have been subject to prejudice for generations, then it makes it that much easier or more likely that people will stigmatize those substances. And, I think an example of that clearly is in the so-called crack era, where again you have two forms of a drug that are chemically very, very similar. You have powder cocaine and crack cocaine, which is just powder cocaine, which is just cocaine in a slightly different form. And at the height of the racist crack scare, we saw a fear campaign that resulted in legislation creating a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for crack law violations versus powder cocaine law violations. Without question, that was racially motivated because crack was perceived to be used by Black communities in a way that powder cocaine was not. And I think that's, it's a prime example that subsequent reforms have reduced that disparity to only 18-to-1, but nevertheless it persists. And so I think the othering that occurs when the bulk of people are unfamiliar with a substance, so the stigmatization of that substance, and the othering that occurs when substances are rightly or wrongly perceived to be used by certain demographic groups, by certain marginalized groups, that facilitates that stigma and relates to the prejudices that are still so common in our society.
Thank you, Will, for being so specific on that. That's really important. And one thing that my listeners know, because I've talked about so many times before, is a lot of that is intentional. Harry Anslinger, and even before him, although he really was sort of the catalyst for a lot of these things, but all of this was intentional. This was this othering. It's not an accident. This wasn't a byproduct. This is the product.
Yes, I think it's very important to point that out. And of course, there's been that widely reported admission by someone involved in the Nixon administration that the war on drugs was launched. The modern iteration of the war on drugs was launched in order to target Black people, to target what they described as hippies. And so, yeah, I think it's important to be very clear that these laws don't just have unintended consequences, they have intended consequences.
Yes, thank you for making that clear. Yes, the quote by John Ehrlichman is the one you're referring to. And even going far back again to Harry Anslinger, who said, I think the quote that we need to repeat time and time and time and time again, because people need to understand just how important racism was as the base of this. Anslinger, in trying to explain why he wanted to outlaw cannabis, marijuana, he said, marijuana makes the darky thinks he's as good as a white man, which is just so blatant, that this racism was so clear from the beginning. And I think a lot of people don't realize that they've swallowed a lot of these lies, hook, line and sinker, because they've never been willing to challenge what they, heard on the news, or, being a guy of my generation who was taught dare and just say no in schools. There's not a lot of willingness, unfortunately, from some people to challenge those ideas.
Yes, and you can look right back to the roots of modern drug prohibition in the early 20th century in the United States, and actually attach a specific form of prejudice to the prohibition of each drug. I mean, marijuana, for example, was associated with Mexican immigrants, and there was a media fear campaign over that. Opium was associated with Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans, and cocaine was associated with Black Americans. And you can look back and see the notorious headlines from the New York Times and many, many other publications that fed into this othering and this sort of public moral panic about it, which resulted in the laws that have caused and fueled and exacerbated the great problems that we see today.
In the second half of the show, I want to talk, specifically about Filter, because, as you know, I'm such a big fan. But let's close out this half with a little more about you. You've worked in this it sounds like a lot of your adult life. Is there something from when you were young that really made you want to get into this? Or what was it specifically that made you go, you know what, this is my passion, this is my path?
I mean, a lot of things feed into that. Of course, as a young person at school and college, I knew lots of people who used and sometimes sold drugs, and it always seemed to me fundamentally unjust that it always seemed to me fundamentally wrong that people could be arrested, criminalized, incarcerated just for doing something that was causing no harm to anyone else, and often causing no harm to the person themselves. But I think it was in 2006 when I began working with incarcerated people in London that it really hit home hard for me. I was confronted with this mass human rights violation of people being incarcerated, which fundamentally I am against anyway. But I also, of course, I was confronted with the outcomes of bad and cruel and targeted drug laws by meeting many people who were incarcerated for drug law violations and who had done nothing very different from the people that I knew in school and college. But most of the people I knew in school and college weren't incarcerated, and these people were. And what's the difference? Well, it was the socioeconomic or the racial background of these incarcerated people. So that really illustrated in the starkest and most heartbreaking terms the human consequences of these cruel and targeted laws, and that fueled my passion, my conviction, my absolute conviction that there is something fundamentally wrong about the way that we approach drugs as a society, and not just the way we approach drugs, but the way we approach people, which manifests through drug policies. But it became clear to me that drug policy was something I wanted to work, current drug policies was something I wanted to work against in some way. And so I took that with me throughout my subsequent career.
Well, I got to say, you know, if you don't hear this enough, I'm glad that you did, because, you know, there really, if Filter didn't exist, thered be a hole. There are other publications that do great work, and I don't want to minimize that. But, you know, as someone who is not only a subscriber, but a donor, I eagerly await when Filter arrives in my inbox, because I know it is going to be packed full of honest reporting around these topics. And as someone who, like I said earlier, spends their days on these topics, there is still a lot in Filter that I'm like, wow, I didn't even hear about that, you know? And so for someone who isn't as tuned in like I am, it's such a lifeline for understanding what's happening.
Well, thanks, Jay. That means a lot to me that you would say that. And of course, you're largely simpatico, and many of our readers are. We're very glad to have a core readership for people who are in the harm reduction movement and very actively engaged with it. But I also think that we would fail as a publication if we didn't reach out beyond that echo chamber and actually change minds from time to time. And some of the best feedback that I ever get is from people who say, you know, I didn't used to think this way about this subject, but then I read something that Filter published and I saw that actually I should probably rethink it. And I think that's the you know, I wish it could happen more often, because that's the absolute core of what we want to achieve is changing the conversation around drugs and many intersecting issues.
So that is a great transition. If people are just loving this, they listening to you going, God, I got to follow what he's talking about. Shout out where people can find you and also, of course, more importantly, find Filter online.
Well, first and foremost, you can find Filter at our website, which is www.filtermag.org. You can also, if you're social media inclined, you can follow us on Twitter. We're filtermag_org on Twitter. You can look up our handle there. And I'm personally at Godfrey Will. I got my name backwards because somebody else got it forwards.
If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that it's not the only thing I do. Choose Your Struggle is an entire brand. I speak, I coach and consult. I have rock bottom storytellers. There's a lot going on. And sometimes I get to a project and I go, man, I can't do all of this myself. So I turn to Fiverr. It's so easy to find incredible professionals who can help me out. I've hired people to help with marketing, help with SEO, help with my website. So much great stuff all on Fiverr. I even found Kid Mental, who did the incredible theme song on Fiverr. So if you have a project that you need some help on, go check out Fiverr. Use the link in the show notes or my podcast website, and you'll help the podcast in the process. Check them out today. Check out My Friends, The Happiness Question, which is a podcast that aims to help listeners find hope, happiness, and inspiration in the world around them. Just like Choose Your Struggle, The Happiness Question features experts and those who have experienced adversity from all around the globe. The Happiness Question will help you find happiness even when it doesn't feel possible. You can listen and subscribe to The Happiness Question on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Oh, choose your struggle.
Subscribe to my Patreon for behind-the-scenes looks at the podcast, sneak peeks, and bonus data. You'll also get a discount on Choose Your Struggle merch. Find it at patreon.com/chooseyourstruggle. Let's talk a little bit about Filter's process. So, you know, where do you find these incredible writers, a lot of whom are reporters, but other ones aren't? I mean, these are people who are writing very personal stories.
Yeah, it's a real mixture, and that's how I would want it to be. I mean, of course, having run several other publications in this space, I did have a pre-existing Rolodex of excellent writers, reporters, essayists, and contributors of all kinds. But many people just come to us at this point, and that's very welcome as well. We receive regular pitches from people we've never met before, and part of our mission is to platform as many different voices and a diverse range of voices. So that's always very welcome. And then we have our core team, of course, and it's not just me. It's Helen Redmond. It's our new deputy editor Castilia Medrano. It's staff writer Ceci Kouabara Blanchard, and our new editorial fellow Lucia Geng. So it's a whole team of people, each of whom have their own perspectives, their own contacts, and we come up with ideas very organically. Of course, we generate quite a number of ideas in-house, but I also want to listen to people in our contributor list and beyond. I mean, we have, I dare say, about 140 people have written for Filter at this point, and I think that we can generate far better ideas by listening to a larger group of people and taking ideas in from outside than we can just a few of us sitting in a room and writing our ideas on the back of an envelope. So yeah, it's a real mixture, and that's how I would want it to be. And I hope we continue to grow and attract an increasingly broad and diverse range of perspectives.
So that's something else that I love about y'all. And you said that so perfectly is that, yes, you have a couple of writers who I, don't miss an article because I know it's going to be good. But occasionally I'll open it up and go, wow, that blew my socks off. Who was that? And it's someone who, they don't even have a profile on your website. It's just someone who was so passionate about the subject. So if somebody's listening and they're like, oh man, I think I have a great article or an idea, how do those people find you? How does that work?
Oh, well, we have an about page where we invite pitches. And to give you a shortcut, the email you should send pitches to is editor@filtermag.org. And I read all of those pitches, and the disclaimer we have on the website is we do get a lot of pitches, and sadly we're not able to respond to all of those that we don't use. However, they are always welcome. They do always get read, and we try to use as many of them as we can in order to continue to build up our network of contributors and really broaden our coverage and make it as good as we can.
I think back to something you said early on in this conversation about how you cannot talk about some of these subjects without talking about things like racism and health in this country. And occasionally there will be an article where I'll be reading the first part and going, how does this fit into Filter? And then I'll get to the end and it ties up. So what is that conversation like where someone approaches you or when someone else in the team and goes, this doesn't exactly fit, but trust me here, I think this is something that needs to be said. How much leeway, I guess, is there inside of the circle of things that you cover?
That's a good question. And it's an internal debate that we're always having. As I said earlier, we'll step out of our core areas where there are obvious connections. And so with incarceration, we don't have to have drugs in the headline or the lead. It is obvious that mass incarceration is connected with drugs, although drug policy is not the only driving factor. It's always an internal debate that we have, how drug focused to be and how more broadly human rights focused to be. And my general rule of thumb is that every week I want to publish stuff that is really focused on and centered on drugs, but I also want to publish stuff that is about broader human rights and social justice themes. To give you one example, we're very shortly going to publish a report about New York's state's adoption of reforms to driver's license suspension laws, whereby people who have their driver's license suspended through not paying traffic fines are now going to have better chances to avoid that license suspension by entering payment plans and so on, and other reforms. Why does that relate to drugs? Well, it does, because every time some people whose driver's licenses are suspended, they have to drive, right? They have to get to their medical appointments. They have to get their kids to school. They have to drive in order to work. There is just no realistic way for them not to drive. But if they're driving with a suspended license, then they're subject to criminalization anytime they get stopped. If they're a person who uses drugs, well, it's ramped up from there because they might have drugs that are discovered during a stop and search. And so I think that's a good example of something. I mean, it's a broader human rights issue because it relates to the criminalization of poverty, but it also clearly links in with people who use drugs, people who struggle with substance use disorders and need to attend treatment programs, methadone programs, whatever it might be. So something like that, which seems on first glance to have nothing to do with our subjects, actually does. And one piece that we're going to publish soon, I hope will illustrate those connections.
I love it, and I go back to my comment from before that even as someone who worked in this space and does, my bookshelf is full of writing about these topics. There are still things that pop up on Filter where, like I said, I'll get to the bottom and go, man, I didn't even think about that as being part of this work. So, I really applaud you and your team for that work. So this may be a harder question, but we are talking, you and I literally are talking here on the 6th of January as just absolute chaos is being sown in Washington, D.C. Things in our nation's capital, in politics in general, and obviously you being from the UK, unfortunately, a lot of the harmful thinking around drugs also exists over there. This is definitely not just an American thing, although America has, or the US, I should say, we're trying not to say America to describe our country anymore, but the U.S. has had an outsized influence on drug policy for far too long. The question I'm going to ask then is with how slow things move in D.C. and the chaos we're seeing today, what gives you a hope around this topic? Yes, people are saying all the time, well, look at cannabis being legalized, but this should have happened a long time ago. And, a lot of the cannabis legalization work is leaving behind the criminal justice piece. So what is giving you hope right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because you can look at it in a hopeful way and you can look at it with a degree of despair at the continuing mass human rights violations and atrocities conducted in the name of the global war on drugs. But you did ask me for the hopeful signs, and I see plenty as well. Oregon, of course, has recently passed the first in the nation all drug decriminalization measure of its kind. We are seeing new things being done that have never been done before, whether it's even cannabis legalization in states that have never done that, whether it's Good Samaritan laws, whether it's naloxone distribution, whether it's the chances of safe consumption sites opening in many US jurisdictions. We've seen, of course, an ongoing battle in Philadelphia and other places. And so there is progress being made, and quite dramatically so. When I look back 10 years to when I was, the early days when I was involved in this movement, in this field, we have moved forward on drug-specific policies in many, many different ways. However, when you look at how far we still have to go, of course, there is a mountain to climb. And part of the reason there's a mountain to climb is not just drug prohibition, but it's the wider inequities in our society. It's the wider economic inequalities. It's the wider racial inequalities. It's the circumstances that create many of the harms that we're talking about. And yes, we want drug policy reform, but we don't just want drug policy reform. We want a fairer society. And if you're talking about that, well, we do still have a mountain to climb, even with the changing administration, which may change things for the better. But of course, the bar has been set so low that's not saying very much. We're seeing all kinds of things being done in the drug policy space that have never been done before. And Filter, of course, will be looking very closely at the implementation and the outcomes of those measures. But my goodness, there's a long way to go.
Yeah, there really is. And thank you for finishing on that, because it leads me into my next question, which is, reading Filter is incredible. And I definitely recommend to everyone, if you haven't heard me fanboy yet in this conversation, but knowledge can only be as good as what you do with it. So if someone reads Filter and they subscribe and maybe they donate, now I should say, that over the summer in 2020, I did a fundraiser on this podcast that raised almost $12,000 for Drug Policy Alliance, which I know also helps fund you guys, right?
We have previously received a grant from DPA, yes.
Yeah, and they're doing incredible work. So my bigger question though is, besides donating or to you, to DPA, to following you, what can people do? What can we be doing to make this progress? Because as you so perfectly said, yes, we've had some minor steps. It's amazing, but good Lord, there's so far to go.
Well, it can seem very daunting, but one thing I would point out is that a lot of activism is at its most effective when it's conducted on a local level. And what injustices do you see where you live? We can talk about drug-related injustices, but we can also talk about if you live in a home and there are unhoused people that live in your neighborhood, do you treat them like your neighbors, or do you treat them like something else? We can talk about, what does policing look like local to you, and what are you doing if you're in a position of privilege to object to what's going on? What are you doing to pressure your local lawmakers and your local councils? Are you seeing NIMBYism in your area about attempts to block innovations that can benefit marginalized people, but which are being opposed by other groups where you live? So I would encourage just involvement and engagement at all levels of activism. But if everybody started locally with what's happening in proximity to them, I think that could have a great effect.
Beautifully put. Will, you and I could talk for hours. I really appreciate this. Before we go into the final questions, though, let me take one more moment to say, please shout out where people can follow you, where they can follow Filter and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, so once again, our website is www.filtermag.org. And if you go there, you may well be prompted to subscribe to either our daily or weekly newsletter, which is a way that you can make sure that you never miss anything we publish. And our Twitter handle, if you're on social media, we're also on Facebook, but on Twitter, we're at filtermag_org.
Well, thank you again for that, and thank you for being here. Just a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. Number one, I was finished with the same too, is, not just during COVID when things have been just so stressful, and again today as we chat and there are rioters in the U.S. Capitol, what do you do for self-care? How do you take a break, take a moment, and take care of yourself?
Well, life can be hard because I'm a parent, and like many parents of young children during these times, there is no downtime because I'm either working or I'm looking after my kids. But one thing about kids that I find is that they do force you to take your mind off of work and off of the wider things that are wrong with the world, and focus just on making sure that they don't smash up your home or something like that. So I am blessed in that way. One of my vices as well is soccer, as it's called in this country, and obsessively following the fortunes of my largely ill-fortuned team is another way that I get my mind out of the filter day to day.
Awesome, well put. So final question is we have spent the last 40 minutes or so learning why we should follow you, but more importantly follow Filter. But outside of that, who are some people that you follow that we should all be, reading, listening to, watching if it's on, TV or something? Who are we missing that we should all be checking out?
Well, we've mentioned Drug Policy Alliance a few times in this conversation, and they are, the preeminent drug policy reform organization. I would recommend following DPA to get a handle on their latest campaigns. I would recommend following their relatively new executive director, Cassandra Frederic, who is an absolute firebrand advocate, someone that really energizes this movement. Also, her one of her predecessors, Ethan Nadelman, who was a huge influence on me getting involved in this field, and now dedicates himself a lot to tobacco harm reduction. We can talk about other publications like The Appeal, which is very good on the criminal legal system. We can talk about organizations on a national level like the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And there are, of course, many, many local organizations. And you asked me a question like that, and I could, if I sat down and thought about it, I could come up with a list of about 100 people and organizations, but which I can't in real time. But I think Twitter is quite a good place to find these folks. If you're going and searching these subjects, if you're following the filter feed and seeing who we retweet, you'll get a good sense of who's out there. And unfortunately, it's a vibrant and powerful and effective movement, because it really needs to be.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on, and thank you. Please pass it on to your entire team for your work. It is so important, and I hope that listening today, even a couple more people sign up to get the Filter newsletters and check out the Filter site, because it's y'all are doing just incredible work.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you once again for your support and for having me on your show today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Anyone who knows me knows I'm a huge sports fan. I start every morning by listening to the Locked On Celtics podcast, and I never miss a Reds game. So when it's time for me to grab a gift for the sports fan in my life, I check out Fanatics. They have everything you need, from the best teams, the favorite players, and all the stuff is good. As a memorabilia and autographs collector, I trust Fanatics. But here's the best part. Fanatics always has some kind of discount going on. From free shipping to 50 to 70% off some items, you're going to get a great deal every time at Fanatics. So check them out using the link in the show notes or from my podcast website, and help the podcast in the process. Check them out today. Find me on social media. Check the link in the show notes or search for me, Jay Shifman, on YouTube and LinkedIn, and Choose Your Struggle on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All right, we've come to the end of another episode of the Choose Your Struggle podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Will Godfrey. I find his work to be so important, and his knowledge on these subjects is incredible. It's vast, and he is such an inspiring guy, and the work he's doing and the team around him, it's so appreciated. So thank you to the entire team at Filter. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Now, we've come to the end of this episode, and I'm going to use the 54 Ways to Ease the Anxious Mind card pack today. And I'm doing this in honor of the inauguration. That happened on Wednesday. Actually, as I'm recording this, it is Wednesday as I record this. You'll notice that I didn't say anything on this episode about the inauguration until this point, because there's a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings that go into that. A very short summary of that is, am I happy we're moving on from Trump? Of course I'm happy. I'm not a Joe Biden fan. I am very worried about what's going to happen under him. I am already seeing us accept too easily the wins that would have been good in 2000 and, let's say, 12 or 14 being applauded today because of how low the bar was set under Trump. And Will mentions that a little bit in this episode. In fact, I used that clip as the preview for this episode because, as he put it, the bar has been set so low that progresses that will get applauded by people under Biden are nothing. It's not even an inch, and we're going to celebrate because at least it's not Trump, and that scares the crap out of me. So that's why I'm not really celebrating this week. I applaud, or not applaud, I'm happy for those of you who do feel excited. And of course, there's reason to celebrate. First woman VP, first black woman VP, first black VP. There's so many things. And of course, moving on from Trump in itself is a celebration, but I'm not really hopeful, and that is weighing on me. So again, these cards, 54 Ways to Ease the Anxious Mind, are for that reason. This is a great card, and I'm going to take this advice right away. It's ask someone for a hug. Ask someone for a hug. That's a good one. And I was encouraged by seeing a lot of those posts on social media. Yes, there's a lot of people celebrating, and that's great. Again, I don't want to rain on your parade. But I also saw a lot of posts saying, hey, I'm not celebrating today, or my celebration is muted, or whatever the case is, and I need others to know that I feel that way. And if you feel that way, there's other people with you. And that's sort of a virtual hug. And so I'm definitely going to take this advice. Go ask my wife and our dog for a hug. Now, your good egg for this week is going to be twofold. Number one, go read something from Filter Mag. Plain and simple, go find something. It's incredible. I've shouted them out before. I've linked their stuff in the show notes before. Go check it out, please. That's your number one. But number two, sort of going to last week's idea of seeing something from someone else's perspective, keep that in mind this week. I've heard from people that I love very close to me that, they're excited for a quote-unquote return to normal, and that just scares the crap out of me because normal that was good for some of us was horrible for others. And that's what really scares me about Biden is that people are going to take their foot off the pedal. They're going to say, great, we've returned to quote-unquote normal, and they're going to forget that normal sucked. Normal was torture for a lot of people in this country and around the world. So I guess my good egg is it's more big picture, and that is if you're celebrating this week and you want to snip at someone or tell someone to just enjoy the moment or whatever the case is, remember that this is, yes, a move on from Trump is a celebration for a lot of us, but then for a lot of other people, myself included, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of hesitancy, there's a lot of worry about what the next step is going to be. And also that just because there's a new leader doesn't mean all the problems that did exist over the last 4 years are gone. So that's the good egg, is be patient with people who are not where you are, who are struggling to find hope at this moment. That's your good egg. Now, one last thing before I finish, and that is remember that Rock Bottom Storytellers is on Wednesday. Please like my Facebook page and get ready to enjoy that. It's going to be incredible. But the most important thing this week, be vulnerable, show your empathy, spread your love, and choose your struggle.